Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are using the Johnson edition, the Thomas H. Johnson editor edition of the complete poems of Emily Dickinson. We turn now to poem 285, The Robins, my criterion for tune. Some have called this Emily's maybe most famous poem, or one of her most famous poems, certainly anthologized a lot. In some ways, we're back to poem 250 that we've already studied. I shall keep singing, birds will pass me on their way to yellower climes, each with a robin's expectation, I with my red breast and my rhymes, late when I take my place in summer, but I shall bring a fuller tune. Vespers are sweeter than matins, signor, morning only the seed of noon. Now, when we did that poem, and our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful you've already worked with our set of introductory comments, and I'm really hopeful that you've already worked with all of our preceding 284 poems. We just finished with 284, The Drop That Wrestles in the Sea. And if you have, then you will be reminded that we have commented a number of times on Emily as American poet. When I travel, I'm often asked this question, especially by those who are not American, what is it that makes an American writer or American poet? And because I've done that series called Talks with Walt, where we did all of the poems of Walt Whitman from the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, you can check that out at learnstrong.net as well. I'm often asked, what is it that makes an American writer, an American poet? And you know, I'll go to Whitman's passage 6 of Song of Myself as an exemplar of what an American writer does as opposed to a, we might say, an English writer. Of course, we've got to start, though, with Emerson. It was Emerson who said, and we've given lectures on all of his essays at learnstrong.net, including, of course, that famous The Poet, where he calls for the American poet. Where's our American poet? And, of course, it's fascinating that we today see Whitman and Emily as the quintessential American poet. Here, Emily will have something to say about being New Englandly, to be a New Englander, and the way in which she will identify, and she'll say that I'm provincial in this regards. Of course, in the moment of calling herself provincial, she's obviously something trans-provincial, right? It's quite remarkable. Notice just in the opening line, she doesn't say, the robin is my criterion. She says it with this, with the apostrophe, the robin's my criterion. And in that moment, she's already playing around with the English language. Notice all the dashes in this poem, which will play around with robins and the robin's song. I find this a remarkable poem on a number of counts. Is this one of the evidences that Emily was part of the transcendentalist movement, much like Emerson, much like Thoreau? We've given full lectures on all the chapters of Walden. I think it's very possible to read this poem that way. But I think there's something far more important going on in this poem. I think that Emily, learning from her study and her reading of Gulliver's Travels, for example, and from her study of Plato's Republic, the value, the power of, what do we call it, perspicacity, insight, that ability to see things for what they are. And why do we see things the way that we see things? I think for Emily, we are a product of all that we have met, to quote the line from Tennyson's Ulysses. In some ways, we're back to Emily identifying with the Amherst or the simple girl. And in some ways, this is another poem about, can we call it discernment, since she calls it that? The robin's my criterion for tune, because I grow where robins do. But were I cuckoo born, I'd swear by him the ode familiar rules the noon. The buttercup's my whim for bloom, because we're orchard sprung. But were I Britain born, I'd daisies spurn, none but the nut October fit, because through dropping it, the seasons flit, I'm taught. Without the snow's tableau, winter were lie. To me, because I see New Englandly, the queen discerns, like me, provincially. Now, there's so many ways to read this poem. I think the genius of Emily is that she's able to just kind of pull off these amazing philosophic insights. She basically rewrites so much of Republic 6 and 7, as we've given lectures at LearnStrong.net. That is to say, the theory of the forms and the cave allegory. In other words, we look at shadows on the wall and we think they're real because we know they exist, but they're not real. They just exist. And there is something beyond those shadows on the wall. And I think she's playing that game. Notice she'll begin again with the robins, my criterion for tune. When we get to poem 348, we'll play around with this idea of the robin. I'll let you enjoy that when we get there. Again, we noticed all of these dashes here. By the way, reminding ourselves that Emily was a player of the piano and accorded apparently quite good. She says, the robin's my criterion for tune because I grow where robins do. I love the word grow here, her use of this word. In other words, I've grown up where I hear robins. So that's how I understand it. She says, but were I cuckoo born, that is to say English, okay, later it will be Britain, born, I'd swear by him. In other words, I love the robin because I'm from New England, I'm from Amherst, but if I grew up in England, I'd love the cuckoo bird, which is their bird, right? I'd swear by him. The ode, familiar, it's interesting that she uses the word ode in this regards, rules the noon. In other words, whatever it is that we're raised around, that's what we come to understand. That's what rules us, if you will, right? And then she'll say it, the buttercups, my whim for bloom. It's interesting that Emily wanted the buttercup flowers at her funeral, and of course, there were lots of them that surrounded that experience of the funeral. My whim for bloom. Whim is, in many ways, it's an American word, right? My whim for bloom. Because, and then we're orchard sprung. Now, the great scholar Wolfe has commented on the fact that the loss of Eden and the post-lapsarian, or the after the fall, takes us back to Milton and Paradise Lost. We've given full lectures at LearnStrong.net over it all. But orchard sprung, in other words, for Emily, she thinks of New England as Eden after the fall, right? That is to say, if England was the Eden, now in America, we live post-Eden. We live in a different place and a different time. But she says, were I Britain born, back to this question of cuckoo birds and the like. By the way, Britain, we'll see when we hit poem 1511, I'd daisies spurn. Daisies, of course, being her favorite flower. Back to poem 106, she calls herself Daisy in those what are called often master letters. Why? Well, daisies represent both at the same time a certain kind of humility or humbleness and fidelity or faithfulness, right? I daisies spurn, none but the nut. And then she moves on, right, into the autumn, into the fall. October 5th, the sign, of course, of autumn bringing winter, but obviously as well, the acorn provides the possibility of new growth. Because, notice she keeps using this word because, through dropping it, that is to say the acorn, the seasons flit. Again, from whim to flit, and flit, again, an American word. And then she'll say it, I'm taught. Now, this reminds us of Walt Whitman's There Was a Child Went Forth. You'll remember in that set of lines, it was like whatever the child saw, that's what the child became. And I love that she joins this notion of education. I'm taught. In other words, I breathe New England air, and she'll get to New Englandly in a second. Without the snow's tableau, it's fun with the internal rhyme here, winter were lie. In other words, if I didn't know how to experience the snow of Amherst, I wouldn't really know what winter was all about. To me, she says, because I see, and now that will join us to that notion of perspicacity, that might be the most important word in all of our study of Emily, right? New Englandly. Now, this will be the only time she uses that phrase that she makes up. But she will use New England already in 215. We'll see it again in 1244, 1407, and 1483. I'll let you guys run that one to ground. And then she'll say it, the queen, which obviously takes us back to poem 283, where she identified with the queen, discerns, there's your key word, like me, provincially. It's the only time in all of her poetry that she uses the word provincial or provincially. And I find this fascinating because the moment you say you're provincial, on some level, you're no longer actually provincial. In other words, you've been able to kind of step out of it and look back and see, oh, well, that's the reason that I hold the views that I hold, because obviously it's the way I grew up, to use her language. At 2a, some have called this Emily's cultural relativism, which, is language of our generation. In other words, she recognizes, I am a product of what I was raised in and around and through. That's our 2a. At 2b, the irony, of course, is abundant in this. She says, I'm not English, I'm American. If I had been raised otherwise, I would have been a different kind of person. Finally, in 3A, Tennyson's Ulysses comes to mind. I'm part of all that I have met. Walt Whitman's A Child Went Forth. I want to suggest Frost Mending Wall. I think this poem had an influence on Frost. Finally, at 3B, to own a poem like this, what environment has made you who you are? I hope that you're enjoying your study of Emily. Thank you.